time we saw that Sigmund Freud is considered to be the father of psychoanalysis, and the foundation of psychoanalysis is rooted in studies of hysteria. It was the first book co-authored by Sigmund Freud with Breuer, and studies in hysteria is something we'll take a look in the original. We'll read a part of it and understand from there. But today we'll just take an overlook about Sigmund Freud, how his journey began, and some of his very core concepts. And slowly we'll enter into Sigmund Freud. So let us first circumambulate, get ourselves acclimatized to this new language, these words, this way of looking at a particular thing, and then enter so that we don't find the writings very abstruse and difficult to go into. So first is studies in hysteria. Last time we talked about what hysteria meant. Would anybody be able to go into it? What Sigmund Freud and people of his time meant by the word hysteria?
Something which has no reason, the problem which has apparently no reason.
No biological reason we can find.
Yeah.
So there were two meanings of the word hysteria. One is the literal meaning of convulsions, that the body gets into a fit, either partially or in totality. So convulsions is one aspect, and second is anything that does not have a clear biological cause. It can be a frozen shoulder, it can be hysterical blindness, it can be hysterical deafness, it can be hysterical paralysis, but anything which does not have a clear biological cause, but is definitely there, not just in the mind, it is exactly there in the body. So in studies of hysteria, in this book, Sigmund Freud takes us through his observations on how in the beginning of psychoanalysis, he was fumbling with ideas, because he was trying to establish at that point something which was almost a blasphemy in science. That being that something psychological can have a biological consequence. That biology and psychology is a two-way traffic. It is not a one-way traffic only from biology to psychology. The very popular case in this context is the case of NAO. It is a must-read, a must-to-be discussed case in any course on psychoanalysis and its evolution. And this case, Freud starts exploring the fundamentals of psychoanalysis. So we will read this case to see how Freud is going about understanding the case of NAO and how he's slowly developing the fundamentals of psychoanalysis. We'll read through the case of NAO. So we'll read some parts of studies in hysteria and much of the case of NAO. Let us now go to the early thinking, not only early thinking, but the central thinking of Sigmund Freud. The central thinking of Sigmund Freud contains these basic postulates. First, he believes that there is a biological basis to the human psyche. And this training as a neurologist never left him, although he realized as he went on discussing the mind that at one point he says, I don't even feel like that I'm discussing science. It almost looks like literature, because he's completely away from the organs of the mind, the biochemistry, the neurochemistry, and so on. So all his life he wanted to create a biological basis for the psyche. Towards the end of his life, he started something called the project, where he wanted to find the biological basis for all his theories. But he could never complete the project, and he died sooner than the project could be completed. In the times he was living, it was virtually impossible because neurology was not at a stage where it could handle investigating the principles of psychoanalysis. So it was bound to happen given the state of knowledge when he was alive. But many Freudians still continue that ambition of trying to find a biological basis for the psyche. And there are some who believe that the psyche is a fundamental fact of nature which cannot be reduced to anything other than itself. This is the statement of Jung. This is not my statement. Jung says that the psyche is a fundamental fact of nature which cannot be reduced to anything other than itself, which means it is at the same level of being fundamental as matter or energy. So we are looking at a model of reality where you have matter, you have energy, you have force, and you have the psyche. It's a model of reality where four elementals come together to constitute the world and the human being. But contrary to that, the materialist philosophers believe that essentially it's only matter from which everything else emerges, including the mind. So the mind there is called epiphenomena of matter, one special phenomena of matter, but still an outcome coming out of matter. It may be an emergent phenomena, but still a phenomena where it comes out of matter, cannot exist independent of matter. So this is a materialist standpoint, and Freud was very much in the material basis. If you come to the East, our own philosophers like Charvaka, they were also materialists. So India has its own tradition of materialism and atheism. And we also have a strange combination of non-materialistic atheism. In the West, either you are materialist and atheist, or you are idealist and believer. But you don't have this tradition of atheism and spiritualism. Can you reflect upon in Indian tradition, where do you find this combination?
You mean atheism and spiritualism?
You don't believe in God, but you may believe in soul, or you may not believe in God, you may not believe in soul, but you may still believe in reincarnation and karma and enlightenment. So if you look at the Buddhist tradition and the Jain tradition, they are atheistic but spiritual. So in the Jain tradition, there is no God, but there is soul. There is law of karma, there is reincarnation, and there is enlightenment. They call it Kaivalya. In the Buddhist tradition, there is no God. Some Buddhists don't even believe in the concept of soul, but there is rebirth and there is enlightenment. So these are strange combinations of the East which you don't find in the West. That you are spiritual, but you are atheistic. So we have our own traditions of atheism, our own traditions of materialism. Let us go back to Freud. In early Freud, in fact, not only Freud, throughout his life, he always believed in the biological basis of the psyche. Although the ambition, the enterprise remained unfulfilled, but he always wanted to root psychoanalysis in the biological basis. This leads us to two fundamental aspects of Freudian thinking. For Freud, there are two fundamental postulates that govern the organism, the human organism. First, survival of the self. Second, survival of the species. The first one leads to manifestation of a psychological force or a psychological entity called aggression. If you have to protect yourself, you need aggression. And survival of species leads to sexuality, and you get into the sexual act because there is so much of pleasure involved in it. Nature has put so much of pleasure in the sexual act. So survival of the self naturally leads to the entity of aggression, and survival of the species leads to pleasure. And there is always a movement to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain. The ideal is to have ceaseless pleasure without a moment of pain. And it does not happen. Can you talk about why?
So because pain is inevitable, हर समय एक साथ तो नहीं रह सकता. It cannot remain the same all the time.
The desire is not able to create a state of endless pleasure without pain because of reality and morality. So I go to a sweet shop, and when I am hungry, I feel as though I should eat all the sweets in the sweet shop and derive all the pleasure. But the moment a few pieces go in, the biology stops cooperating. And if I force myself to eat, it becomes actually pain giving rather than pleasure giving. So the body wants homeostasis and the mind wants endless excitation. So there is a built-in conflict in our hardware. So first, reality does not allow, morality does not allow, and in reality, one of the components of reality is the way our whole system is. That the system is not geared to tolerate states of endless pleasure and excitation. We have to come back to normalcy. After a manic high, we have to crash. We can't have a manic high for a long time, sustained. The body is not geared for that. So this is one important concept of Freudian thinking, that survival of the self, survival of the species, aggression and pleasure, and avoidance of pain. These are fundamental elements in our mind. So we see two fundamental forces, the force of pleasure and the force of aggression. The force of pleasure often referred to as libido. So libido and the aggressive instinct. So often the language used is the libidinal instinct or the libido, or the force of pleasure and the force of aggression or aggressive instinct. This is the way language is normally used. So we can see two fundamental forces in the Freudian thinking at this moment. The force of libido or pleasure, the force of aggression. Then Freud talks about the component instincts, and very important. And why does he call them component instincts? The word component instincts is important. It has two words in the phrase, component and instincts. Instincts we all understand, something there by birth. And component meaning these are not independent products by themselves. These are spare parts which are then going to go into an assembly under a new organization. And therefore, these four elements Freud calls as component instincts. What Freud says is this, that in early childhood, all the four, they operate very independently. So in early childhood, these four component instincts, namely sadism, masochism, voyeurism, and narcissism, some people also put exhibitionism there, they are operating independent of each other. But as we grow up, all of them come together under an overall genital organization, and they become components of the larger erotic instinct or the sexual instinct. So let us understand these concepts. These are very important concepts in the Freudian thought. First is, let us know what they mean, and then let us try to understand how they come together in the genital organization of adult sexuality, and then where do we find them in human nature, in our life. Let us start one by one. First, let us look at each of the component instincts, understand them by definition, operation, and then go in details of them. First component instinct, sadism. Anyone, what would it be? What is sadism? Is there anyone behind the Iron Curtain?
No, sir. So you have to explain.
Fiona?
Yes. Sorry, hi. I have a call going on.
Okay, easy. Okay. Okay. So, sadism refers to the pleasure that we get by inflicting pain on somebody. So when we show aggression to somebody, it is not always only for self-defense. It can also be because of revenge, or it can be, revenge is more like seeking justice and reducing the tension of our victimization. So this is like moving from negative to zero kind of situation, but still you can call it sadism in some way. But pure sadism is when it gives you a kick to give pain to somebody. So sadism is the pleasure you get by inflicting pain on somebody.
Excuse me, sir. So I was reading the case files of criminals, like I wanted to write something on them. So I was reading the case files of criminals, and there are many, Bahar ke especially, criminals. They are like this only. They have a pattern. Unko isi cheez mein they find pleasure, and whatever the crime they are committing is not by accident. They have it in their mind, and they are committing the crime. And in many cases, even the parents are torturing their children even.
Right.
Bahut sare cases. Yeah.
So you can see the manifestation of sadism there. Mm-hmm. I can give you an example. Once I was sitting in a cafe, a cyber cafe, and there were a few young school children, the very chubby types, and they were playing a group computer game in which one team is supposed to kill the general of the other team. So one of them was able to do it and he killed the general. And he said, I killed him, I did not enjoy killing him. In Hindi he said, मार दिया लेकिन मजा नहीं आया. तो तड़पा तड़पा के मारना चाहिए था, तब मजा आता. So ये जो तड़पा तड़पा के मारना है, that is because of sadism. Okay. We derive pleasure from inflicting pain on somebody. So this is a component instinct, Freud says, built into us. How we manage it is a second issue. But by birth, we do find it there. And many times we find children very young, particularly in their anal stage, 2 to 3.5 years of age. We can see them killing small ants or torturing very small insects. So that is the sadism part of it. Second is the reverse of it, masochism. Masochism is the pleasure you get in giving pain to yourself. So masochism is the reverse of sadism. You derive pleasure by giving pain to yourself. And obviously, a sadist and a masochist make a very good pair. It's a pathological pair, exactly like that of a narcissist and a dependent. So it's one of those pathological pairs. Or a paranoid and a manic. Third is voyeurism. Voyeurism is the peeping Tom. We derive pleasure by looking at something. At one time, Freud called it scopophilia, the pleasure through looking. And we have our own great Vatsyayana, right, who wrote Kama Sutra, and he was a voyeur par excellence, who would look into what people are doing in a sexual sense. And that is voyeurism, that we derive pleasure by looking at things. Often looking at things which are social taboo to look at. But in general also, even non-taboo elements, the pleasure by looking at it. So there is an element of visual pleasure and a slight element of transgression. Yes. Yeah, Honey, you were saying something?
No, sir.
So voyeurism, and then we have narcissism, which we have seen, the treating of one's own body almost as a sexual object, or excessive love for oneself. Grandiosity, thinking of oneself as self-sufficient, one being the whole world. Excessive love of oneself, grandiosity about oneself. Some people also call exhibitionism as one part of narcissism, or separately, that we have a desire to exhibit ourselves and derive pleasure by exhibiting ourselves. So Freud says these component instincts are there by birth. There is no why to it. They are there by birth and they function independently in the first few years. And slowly they are all organized together under the umbrella of genital organization. So then they start functioning under a umbrella of eros, and you can find them, all of them, in the sexual context also. That many people, in terms of their sexual practices, they give pain to the partner, or they ask the partner to give pain to them, or they like watching somebody else doing it, maybe in a movie or in a magazine, and at times to exhibit their own bodies. So all of this, they independently operate when in early childhood. Slowly they are all brought together under an overall erotic umbrella and mostly the sexual component of it. So the genital organization slowly starts coordinating this whole set of otherwise autonomously functioning entities. If the genital organization breaks down, then again they would become independent and gain far more power than they would have in the genital organization, because they would remain uncoordinated, unattenuated. Any questions on this? Sadism,
No, understood.
masochism, voyeurism, exhibitionism.
Yeah.
Now let us go deeper and understand then how these concepts operate in life in various contexts. So we can take one example from each of them in the pathological context, sublimated context, everyday context, in mythology and art, to really develop a grip on the concept. And this will involve both the clinical application of psychoanalysis and non-clinical application of psychoanalysis. So let us take first the concept of sadism. So we can find one pathological example, sublimated. Sublimated meaning something which is accepted socially. So something pathological is converted into something accepted socially. Something which is everyday, something that you find in mythology, something that you find in art. Can you think of any example of sadism? First, let us start with pathological example. Torture can easily be a pathological example. Somebody being tortured in the prison for no reason. Or parents torturing children. Pathological example. Sublimated.
Upper caste, lower caste, like earlier it was upper caste and lower caste, that it was happening earlier in earlier days.
At that point, they would call it sublimated. At present point, we would call it pathological.
Okay.
Today, what we would call sublimated would be that, let us say, you give pain to a criminal in public to prevent more crime.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yes.
you are torturing somebody who is an enemy of the country to get the secrets out of him to save the country. So while you are doing torture, it's socially accepted because sublimated to a larger purpose. It's not for a personal profit. Everyday example of sadism. In India, it is quite common when employers shout at their mates, or even though you can give salary on the 1st of every month, deliberately not giving it till the 10th, until the maid asks you 3 or 4 times. That is a very subtle form of sadism in everyday life. In mythology, you can look at the character of Kans. He wanted to kill children of his sister to save his own life, but he could have easily done it by giving poison or any medical thing. But he would pick up the child and splash the child on the wall. So that is a sadistic act of killing the child. And in one of the dreams, in the dream analysis book of mine, I have analyzed this book, this dream, where this happens. that in the dream, the dreamer dreams of Kans and that killing of that child, and how it leads to very subtle forms of incest and anger. Okay. So in mythology, you can have the character of Kans who smashes the children on the wall and does not kill them peacefully. He wants to kill them dramatically with a lot of pain. Similarly, in art, can you think of any sadistic character in art, literature, films?
I think sadistic character could be, I mean, I don't have a particular character in mind, but any of these serials, the typical Hindi serials that you see, I think the portrayal of any sass would, I think, fit this.
Yeah, true. So any Lalita Pawar character you can pick up.
Yeah. And was the movies of Gurudutt, you know, he used to show, I don't know whether it was sadistic or not, but Gurudutt's movie, it was depth of life, meaning of life, and he used to show them in his movies.
That will come in the next masochism.
Okay.
Okay. The exploration of pain, the obsession with pain, the love of pain. In Indian aesthetics, we call it Karun Ras. Contrary to Western thinking, we don't just classify masochism per se as pathological. Right? We also feel that there is a aesthetic, artistic, and existential part to it, and we actually define it as a rasa. That one of the rasas.
But doesn't that existential part come from a pathology? I mean, essentially, that's not a masochism wouldn't be a normal thing and a very welcome thing. It would be a more of a isko kya ho gaya, ye kyun aisa kar raha hai kind of thing, right?
So that raises questions like, should we have definition of what is normal and pathological by the standard of the average? Should we have an election? Is it a question of democracy? That can be one way, and that is the way it is normally thought of, that because most people think it is not right, it is not right.
I think it also has something related to self-worth, masochism. Right. I think is also the thing.
True. So this question that liking of pain, is it pathological because the majority believes it's pathological? Or is it pathological because it's scientifically pathological? So is it a question of science or is it a social question? It can be handled both ways. One way to look at it is to say, because most people don't relish pain, therefore if somebody relishes pain, he is pathological. But the point is he is not complaining. One part. Second way to look at it is that in the relishing of pain, the body and mind may get damaged. And therefore, there is objectively a reason not to relish pain. Nothing productive will come out of it, and therefore one should not relish. And then the question will be, what if the body is not damaged in any way, and you go into this masochistic phase occasionally and relish it? Now that would be the state of an artist. And it would also raise the question, what are you doing with pain? Is it just a self-destructive movement or is it a creative movement? So if you go into pain for a creative movement, it's a different thing altogether. If you go into pain for self-destruction, that would be a different thing. So slowly we are expanding the meaning of these words, and we are bringing in the nuances of how different things are associated with these words. That's very difficult to say that something is just black or white. And we have to see the application of this, existence of this in a variety of contexts, and then put everything together to do an assessment in a particular context. Okay. So first we have looked at sadism. Now let us look at masochism. Yeah, please.
How would you define something to be pathological? Like what is a textbook definition of pathological?
Impairment to self or harm, impairment to self or impairment to others. That some way interpersonal functioning or professional functioning of the self or interpersonal functioning or professional functioning of the other is damaged in some way. So that is the normal thing. And what is the level that is by and large socially determined? So we are still not at the stage where psychiatry can be purely scientific. For example, in certain tribes, there are festivals where on those occasions, people walk on the coals. Now that would be considered psychotic or something pathological, right, if we do it. But where it is an accepted social practice, we don't label them psychotic for doing it. So even in the chapter on psychosis, there is a mention that it has to be not accepted by society. So psychiatry also has a very strong social component, because we are indexing the behavior to the normal, the common. We are not indexing the behavior to the ideal. And the common will be the statistical average. So the society comes in. So masochism, pathological form, sublimated form, everyday form, in mythology, in art.
You were asking us for examples of these?
Yes, yes. One pathological example, one example of sublimation, one everyday example, one example in mythology, one in art of masochism, giving pain to oneself and feeling good about it.
Okay, so I had seen, so I'm talking about art first. I had seen.
Fiona, I'll have to send you the link. It's less than 1 minute.